All right, y'all. Today is February the 20th, 2025. Astigmatism in My Soul. The podcast was sold, Gumby Publishing. Sean Xavier Gumby Jr. You know myself, Sean Xavier Gumby Sr. Wish to defame, slander, or libel anybody as it relates to this video. I will be coming strictly from court documents, which is public information that you can download online. Now, today we're going to deal with Demetrius Flannery, or Big Meech, filed an emergency motion for compassionate relief. This is dated May the 4th, 2020. Okay? Now, this motion is filed during COVID-19, right? And this is a phone hearing, right? And I want to lay the ground rules that the judge laid down to everybody right from the door. Okay, since this is a telephone hearing, here are a couple of ground rules. If you're on speakerphone, please take it off the speakerphone and use the handset. Also, if you are not speaking, please mute your phone. And when you do speak, please identify yourself by name each time, and unless I address you personally by name. Then it goes on to say, the judge says, right now, Big Meech is locked up at FCI Sheridan in Sheridan, Oregon, right? Now, the judge, is that the judge still talking? Right, so the judge is still laying the ground rules, right? And he's going through the motion. Now, Meech's attorney files this motion, and in this motion, he lays the foundation and juxtaposes Terry Flannery, or Southwest T, and Demetrius Flannery, or Big Meech, that they're brothers. They were indicted on the same case. They were co-defendants. They were both leaders of BMF. They both got the same amount of time. Everything is the same. Now, in this motion, the attorney for Big Meech says this. He points to a circumstance that his brother, who was also a co-defendant, who was given the same sentence, who apparently did apply to the Bureau of Prisons for compassionate release, and the Bureau of Prisons granted that request and has released him to home confinement subject to quarantine protocols. Now, that is their argument, right? So, that's not gonna fly, right? Because right here at the outset of the case, you heard the judge just say that Terry did apply to the Bureau of Prisons for compassionate release. But I've read somewhere else in this document, and this is the emergency motion for compassionate release dated May 4th, 2020. I've read somewhere else in this document where Southwest T or Terry Flannery didn't apply. The BOP looked at his situation. Maybe he did, but just listen, hear me out. They looked at his situation. They determined that Southwest T or Terry Flannery was morbidly obese. He was way overweight. He had a heart condition. He was a better behaved inmate. He only got into one fight when he was in prison. He had more good time, and that he had served more of his sentence than Big Meech had served at the time that COVID hit and he was being considered for early release, compassionate release. Now, and that's the argument that the U.S. attorney is gonna put forth when it's her turn to go. But right now, this is Meech's lawyer. So, while Meech's attorney is going through this, the judge steps in and says, yo, there is much made about the fact that that your client had a murder charge pending against him, right? And he asks Dawn Eisen, who is the U.S. attorney arguing for the government, Spelman College graduate. What's up, Dawn? I went to Morris Brown. Um, Dawn Eisen says she had just received word from an assistant U.S. attorney in Atlanta that there was a pending murder charge against Big Meech with a warrant, right? This is what comes up. So then Meech's lawyer takes back over, and he talks about that the Bureau of Prisons made a decision sua sponte to release Terry. Now, sua sponte means of its own accord, right? Of its own will. It wasn't pushed to do it by emotion or whatever. The Bureau of Prisons made a decision, and frankly, Judge, I think it was sua sponte. I don't know that it was requested. But regardless, the BOP made a decision to release Terry Flannery to home confinement based on General Barr's memo. Okay? And, he goes on to say that basically that Terry's health conditions are more severe, that Terry was better behaved in prison, making him a less likely recidivist, right? And he goes on to say that, remember, the judge interjected while he was getting ready to start his argument and said, what about this murder charge against Meech in Atlanta? He comes back and says, Judge, there is no pending murder charge against Demetrius Flannery. Now, the problem is, I don't take joy in citing Berger or using the language I did. I try to follow the Neil Fink Code of Respect, federal law enforcement, and I do have tremendous respect for them. But for a sentence in a brief to say there was a murder charge pending, not that there hasn't been an order closing the case, or yet there may not be an order specifically stating that, it was not presented to the grand jury, not hedging or qualifying that, but to specifically lead this court to believe that there is some kind of open murder case waiting for Demetrius Flannery is either a fabrication or is extremely lazy in determining the deciding factor. So Meech's attorney is going at Dawn Eisen saying that there is no murder charge, right? Because they got some kind of notice that it was exonerated and the bond was exonerated, something to that effect. This is Meech's attorney's argument. Post office guy. And if the court agrees that Demetrius and Terry's situation are very similar, which I think it will upon review of the record, which I know this court is very precise and thorough, then there really is no justification, at least not factually or legally, and certainly not equitably, as to why Terry should be going home tomorrow to home confinement, but Demetrius remains subject to a potential death sentence. And I'm going to briefly go through the other distinctions other than the murder charge, which was not pending, that the government lays out. So that was where my man was coming from, and Meech's attorney talks about Meech has hypertension, right? Benign hypertension. That's what they call it in here, right? And this was a dope part, right? So he's bringing that up. I also think a number 2 applies in most of these COVID cases, especially for high-risk individuals like Big Meech who have uncontrolled hypertension that is not being adequately treated. So he is shedding light or attempting to shed light on the fact that Big Meech has hypertension and he's not being adequately treated for it, right? And we're going to deal with that a little later too. Hold on, y'all. So that's this argument. So check this part out, right? So Meech's attorney is in the courtroom and he says this, right? He's saying, yo, Meech got high blood pressure. You know what I'm saying? He needs compassionate release. Demetrius' blood pressure hovers around 140/90. That is stage 1 hypertension, period. That is with treatment, that he is at 140/90. The judge says he's not up to 140. This is on the record. The judge jumps in. He's not up to 140. 138 was the highest reading. And then there was another one that was lower if you're talking about the systolic. And the diastolic number was normal. So all my nurses out there, all my doctors, go in the comment section and talk about systolic and diastolic and what's normal and what's not normal and what's hypertension. Y'all go down there and do all that. So the judge is on point. Listen, man, the feds is the truth, man. The feds is the truth, man. Homeboy, Meech's lawyers up there trying to, you know what I'm saying, slide some past. My man's like, no, it wasn't. So, you know, you be thinking that these judges got all these cases and they don't read these cases. They not take. Well, this particular one is, he stopped him, said, no, it ain't. His highest reading was 138. I'm talking, then Mr. Fink says, I'm talking about the 2 readings from 2019 for Big Meech, and I'm pulling it back up here. The court says, as am I. Mr. Fink, I see it hovering around 140 over. I say hovering around 140/90. I see, let's see, 138/80, 134/87. And what did I do with this? And I believe that there was another one, 138/81. So the different diastolic and systolic on only 2 measurements over a 1-year period demonstrate that the J&C guidelines that's hypertension or at least borderline hypertension. And that's with treatment. So that was the argument. That was the argument. Then, so now here's a key point. Check this out. So prior to Meech filing the emergency motion for compassionate release, he filed the previous motion for a 2-point reduction. If the court were to follow that Judge Cohn did and go at the bottom end of the guidelines, the new guidelines would put him at 324 months. And he's entitled to those 2 points, and it was stipulated by the government. So he has served the majority of his sentence, over 60% of his sentence. Then the judge jumps in. Well, when he offered those 2 points on an early occasion, he ended up agreeing to withdraw his motion. What was that all about? So the judge asks Meech's attorney, well, when we offered him the 2 points, he had filed a motion for a 2-point reduction. And the judge agreed. And Dawn Ison is going to go into it. When he offered those 2 points on an earlier occasion, he ended up agreeing to withdraw his motion. What was that all about? Now, this is what Meech's attorney says. You know, Judge, that was right before I met one of the folks that were looking for Demetrius' attorney. They were dissatisfied with his advice. I don't think he understood exactly how the sentencing guidelines worked. What was being asked for. He didn't understand the stipulation. I think it was a communication problem, Judge, and I have been trying to rectify that. And before I actually filed the motion, we were all confronted with this COVID-19 crisis, so that is why it was withdrawn. But this is a lie, because the attorney that Meech used to file the motion to get the 2-point reduction was an assistant U.S. attorney, right? How wouldn't he know, you know what I'm saying, the sentencing? He knows probably more than this dude. He was an assistant U.S. attorney, but Meech's attorney says, I don't know why, right? They were dissatisfied with his advice. I don't think he understood exactly how the sentencing guidelines work. How could you say that about an assistant U.S. attorney? But, so Meech applied for this 2-point reduction. They gave it to him. They agreed to give it to him, right? But I think they had to unseal some documents because there's a motion to temporarily unseal exhibits for the limited purpose of providing a copy to the government and immediately resealing them, right? This came along with the same thing, right? At the same time. So, then they talk about Little Meech, and this is where 50 Cent is telling the truth. I don't think any of this narrative about his 19-year-old son, who was in tears with me on the phone as I talked to him about it, who was a student and a good level-headed young man who is taking acting classes. So with 50 Cent saying he paid for, it doesn't say 50 Cent paid for the acting classes, but he's taking acting classes, and 50 Cent said he paid for his acting classes. So this is the argument for Big Meech to get a compassionate release for COVID-19 by his attorney. Now, the U.S. attorney comes in, right? Hold on, I gotta come to the last page because some of this is cut off. Sorry about that, y'all. All right, so we good with that. So I took care of that. Now, Dawn Eisen, Spelman College graduate, I went to Morris Brown. Shout out to Spelman. I took a class at Spelman too. When I went to Morris Brown, I was at Morris Brown from 1987 to 1993. I took a class at Spelman. I took a class at Morehouse, class at Clark, but I went to Morris Brown though. Dawn Eisen, the United States attorney arguing for the government, comes in and she lays it out that number one, Big Meech hasn't exhausted his administrative remedy, meaning you had to apply for the compassionate release as it related to COVID, give it 30 days to run through the process and have them determine yes or no. You know, her thing is he wanted to file, and because he sent a letter to the warden, but before the warden could get the letter and consider it, he files a motion with the court. And she's saying he can't jump in front of everybody. He has to do what everybody else is doing, right? Now, check me out. He demands that his case be treated differently from his brother. Now, Dawn Eisen is a black girl. I think she's from Detroit. Check her out. She says the government hasn't stepped back on the fact that Big Meech, both Flannery brothers, were co-leaders in this case. That would be ridiculous to even suggest that they weren't. But what is different is that even while in prison, Big Meech has continued to promote his lifestyle, promote his activity when he was when he was out and a member of BMF and engaging in this type of activity. He has conducted interviews. This is even supported by Mr. Flannery's brief himself. But what is fundamentally misunderstood by this brief is that when Big Meech fundamentally misunderstood is that, what is fundamentally misunderstood is that what is important to Detroit and to the black community in particular, that the representations made by Mr. Flannery in that brief in his motion to this court further perpetuates those stereotypes. it hasn't pointed to one thing that would make Big Meech appear to be a positive influence in the black community or in the Detroit community. And it's really interesting that the brief doesn't talk about the positive impact on the hip hop community, which could include all races, but in the Detroit community and the black community in particular. It really is misunderstanding of what's important in the black community and what Big Meech any evidence of what that positive impact might be. So this is a black girl, right? Saying that, he hasn't changed since he's been in prison. He's conducted interviews from in prison, still promoting the BMF lifestyle, and that he never was a good impact on the black community, and he would, or Detroit, and wouldn't be if he got a compassionate release. And she also brings up later on down the line how his son, Little Meech, who was a rapper at the time, was promoting on social media, wearing BMF shirts, smoking weed in the videos. It talks about that in there, showing old pictures of Big Meech when he was out on the street, like still promoting that legacy. So they be watching social media. Now, this is the part I'm talking about. Remember, I was just telling y'all about the 2-point reduction that he withdrew, that his current lawyer is saying, yo, the lawyer that he had when he filed that original motion to get the 2-point reduction, this is before the legitimate 2-point reductions he got for the First Step Act and the resentencing, the reworking of the guidelines, the videos I did last week, right? Or the other day. He filed a 2-point request for a 2-point reduction before them came through, okay? Remember, those was in 2021. One was in 2021, one was in 2024. He filed a motion for a 2-point reduction in 2020. And I just told y'all that his current lawyer is saying, oh, the lawyer that he had didn't understand the sentencing guidelines, didn't know what he was doing, he was confused. But that nigga was a assistant U.S. attorney who left the government and opened up his private practice. So how he not gonna know when he was on the prosecution for the government for so many years? Now, this is Dawn Ison. Now, he is faced with that position of his own doing, because back then in March, probably 2020, when the government was willing to agree that he receive the 2-level reduction, which this court knows that the government could have contested, because the government can contest. I mean, it wasn't automatic. It's not an automatic 2-level reduction. We have the right to contest that if necessary, if the person is a violent person, if the person has done something to which we think that they are not entitled to that, but the government agreed to it. We was gonna give it to him. But it was because he was demanding. He had the former U.S. attorney as his attorney. The former U.S. attorney, Jeff Collins, was his attorney on that motion. And he says he can't understand what he is saying. If he is to believe, he was demanding that he gets the same guideline range as his brother, when his brother doesn't have a criminal record and a criminal history category, and his criminal history category was 1, and he does. And Meech had a higher guideline range. And because he couldn't get that, and I would speculate as to other reasons why he didn't want that done, but I won't. It would be pure speculation. This is what Dawn Ison is saying. And I would speculate as to other reasons why he didn't want that done, but I won't. it would be pure speculation. But because the government wouldn't agree to reduce his guideline range to the same guideline range as his brother, he withdrew. He directed his attorney to withdraw his motion. MEECH told his attorney, who was the assistant U.S. attorney in a prior life, who had a private practice, to withdraw the motion. And this is what she's saying, because in order to get that motion, in order to get that 2-point reduction, there had to be a reason why. Why should we give you two-point reduction? For what? For what? And maybe this has something to do with there was a motion to temporarily unseal exhibits for the limited purpose of providing a copy to the government, right? So some documents needed to be unsealed. Dawn alludes, and I would speculate as to other reasons why he didn't want that done, but I won't. It would be pure speculation. So, you know what I'm saying? Then she talks about how he had a razor in prison, a hazardous tool. You know, she acknowledges that Big Meech has an elevated blood pressure or hypertension, but she goes on to say he's doing all right. You know, he's not there's a bunch of inmates that have this, right? So he's stable, his health is stable. Then she talks about Terry. In addition to that, Your Honor, Mr. Terry Flannery has a history of having actually heart conditions. Mr. Demetrius Flannery alludes to heart issues or cardiac issues in his motion, but he does not specify exactly what they are. Terry Flannery, in fact, has pulmonary hypertension, which is specifically cited in the CDC and in the CDC materials as being a serious underlying condition. He has that in addition to obesity. And they even call it morbidly obese. Then Dawn Eisen, the U.S. attorney, this is another reason why she argues against Big Meech getting a compassionate release. I guess at some point in Atlanta, this dude felt like a car was gonna hit him, and he touched the car, and it was some BMF niggas in the car. They got out of the car and beat him to death. They beat the man to death in the parking lot, right? So she's talking about, you know, him being involved with that, you know. It is not recounted in the pre-sentence report because, Your Honor, as this court is aware, this was a multi-jurisdictional prosecution. But I will tell you this, is that I know this personally because one of the relatives of one of the victims that Mr. Flannery, Big Meech, that is, killed, would call me in tears with some of the reasons that are demonstrated in this brief. She talks about he had big billboards in Atlanta like BMF, The World Is Yours, BMF billboards, exotic parties. Buckhead in Atlanta instituted a curfew to keep them niggas out of Buckhead. That's what she says, and she don't say niggas, but that's me. And one night, after they left one of these clubs with all their money, driving all their fancy cars, the Rolls Royces and all of this, one kid put his hand out to touch to keep the car, to prevent the car from hitting him, and they beat the kid to death in the parking lot. And it was one of his relatives that called me throughout this prosecution in tears because Mr. Demetrius Flannery in particular, I know that that's not to trivialize Terry Flannery's conduct, but Demetrius Flannery and his set in Atlanta, just how people feel to this day, respect him and just really glamorize his lifestyle. Here's the part. Here's what a part. This is where I clean that up. The bottom line is this, Your Honor. Mr. Terry Flannery did not file a motion for compassionate release. The BOP has been vigorous in their initiative to make sure that they reach the most vulnerable inmates at this time, and Mr. Terry Flannery presents a more vulnerable inmate than his brother. And then they go on to say that, Terry Flannery wasn't as much of a recidivism risk as was Big Meech, right? Now, the judge denies the motion. Doesn't give it to him. Check this part out. This is United States response opposing the defendant's motion for compassionate release, or alternatively, request or recommendation for home confinement. He starts going on about BMF and Big Meech. For nearly 15 years, Big Meech reigned over one of the most notorious drug trafficking organizations in this district's history. He got 360 months and 240 months respectively, concurrent sentences. 64 other members and associates charged in this district were convicted of drug and money laundering conspiracies. For this, his motion should be denied. Then he starts talking about his background. This is the judge in his response. After previously facing mandatory life in prison due to the large scale of quantities of cocaine BMF distributed under Big Meech's leadership and the over $21 million in assets seized by the government. On November 19, 2007, Flannery pled guilty to 1 count of continuing criminal enterprise and 1 count of money laundering conspiracy. Let me read that to you again. It's snowing, y'all. Snow coming down. After previously facing mandatory life in prison due to the large-scale quantities of cocaine BMF distributed under Flannery's leadership, so he was facing mandatory life, but he only got 360 months to life. Just wanted to throw that out there. But he eventually gets denied. They talk about some other arrests. In addition to the indictment in this case, he had 3 other pending charges: murder, forgery, giving a false name to police, and felony in possession of a firearm. His only underlying medical condition are hypertension, hyperlipidemia, esophageal reflux, low back pain, all of which are under treatment by prescription drugs and are stable. Right? Then he goes into, hold on, y'all. Y'all doing all right? Stay with me. Don't go nowhere. According to the BOP, Demetrius Flannery or Big Meech's medical conditions include hypertension, benign essential, hyperlipidemia, esophageal reflux, and low back pain as of March 30th, 2020. And all of these conditions are in treatment through a standard drug regimen. Flannery has 4 active prescriptions, 2 of which require daily ingestion. He takes 1 25 milligram tablet of hydrochlorothiazide for his hypertension and 2 40 milligrams of atorvastatin for his hyperlipidemia daily. Flannery takes 2 other medications as needed for acid reflux, and lower back pain. Then they cited this. This is another reason why he got denied. Big Meech claimed that BMF had invested $500,000 to $1 million in a single rap artist under BMF Entertainment, who was a BMF member indicted in Atlanta. And that it can do that because BMF already has all the money, cars, houses, clothes, jewelry, and hoes. This is in the record. So they go on your social media, man. They look at what you post. So he got denied. The judge denied him. The judge denied him. He got denied for the compassionate release. And Terry went home. Terry's was clean. You know, and then later he got the legitimate court order reduction in points for the changing of the sentencing guidelines in the First Step Act. But as we noted in here, he was facing mandatory life. For the amount of drugs that he was dealing, he was facing mandatory life. He didn't get it. And he hired an attorney to file a motion for him to get a 2-point reduction, right? Which the government said, I bet, we're going to give it to you. But I think, I'm speculating. I think in order for him to get that 2-point reduction, they had to unseal some documents. And MEECH of his own accord, MEECH of his own, under his own volition of his own doing, when it got to that point, because the government said, bet, we'll give it to you. We ain't gonna contest it. We don't have to give it to you, but we're gonna do it. But we're gonna need to see this, and this. And he backed out. He told his lawyer to withdraw the motion. And they was gonna give him a 2-point reduction. Sean G, podcast was sold. It don't never stop. Y'all make sure y'all follow me on my Instagram. Shout out to all my new subscribers. Appreciate all of y'all. Shout out to Hickey Freeman. What else? That's it. Peace.